Matt will be talking to us a little bit later today. He's going to be continuing the series we've been doing this year on the book of Mark. So it'll be lovely to hear the next instalment in that one. He's asked for a Bible reading this morning from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat.
Morning, everyone. My name is Matt. I'm one of the leaders here at MCC, and again, let me extend a very warm welcome. It's great to have you here with us this morning. This morning, as you've already heard, we're working our way through the book of Mark. So the book of Mark, otherwise known as his gospel. So gospel meaning good news. So the good news of Jesus, Mark's account of the good news of Jesus, his biography, if you like, of Jesus. So it's definitely good news, yes, and it's ultimately good news, yes. But along the way, I'm going to suggest that it's also disturbing news. So it's disturbing news. Jesus, if you like, is disturbing. He leaves people in these stories that we're going to go through disturbed, no doubt. And he leaves us, the readers of these stories and his gospel, at least a little bit disturbed as well. And we can be certain that this is absolutely no accident. Mark wanted his audience, both then and now, to have to reckon, to kind of grapple with, if you like, the person, the figure of Jesus. So just by way of a quick refresher in terms of where we've come from and the background of Mark, it's the shortest of the four Gospels of Jesus, about Jesus. So it's fast-moving, it's really action-packed, it has less of Jesus' teaching and more of his doing, if you like. And there's a good chance that it was written for a non-Jewish audience, so that is like a Gentile audience, so people like us without any of that kind of background. There's also a good chance that the original audience, so the people that Mark was first kind of specifically written for, was the church, Christians in Rome. And it would have been Rome at the time of Nero, as you're probably familiar with. Probably one of the high points of Christian persecution by the Roman Empire was under the rule of Nero. And again, as you'll see today, hopefully, it can be a confronting book at times. So again, Mark confronts us with the person of Jesus. And as you'll definitely see, Jesus, particularly in these accounts, these couple of chapters, he's not a particularly simple figure, if you like. So he's way too provocative to be simply a Jesus that's meek and mild. He displays way too much authority, self-claimed authority, to be simply a good moral teacher. And he makes too many radical claims on people to be just a good righteous example, if you like. So he's so hard to put in one simple box. That's one of the points that I think Mark makes. So we've got 4 stories, and we're going to work through these one by one. We're not going to have time to dive into the details of each of these 4, but we're going to try to unpack the main themes, if you like. If you've got your Bibles with you, I'd strongly encourage you to open up to Mark chapter 4:35 and follow along if you can. But here's the big picture that I think you can put the rest of this talk in. And that reference is Mark 4:35. That's where we're starting. Here's the big kind of framework, if you like. So if you remember nothing else, just remember this. So in each of these 4 examples, Jesus enters into some dark, challenging social scenarios. Really dark, really challenging. That's the first thing. Secondly, Jesus works a miracle or miracles there in the midst of those scenarios. And the third element, people react in very different ways to what Jesus does and who he is. So again, number 1, Jesus enters into these dark, challenging scenarios. Number 2, he performs some kind of miracle, maybe more than one in that scenario. And number 3, people react in these very different ways. So that's, if you like, where we're going. So the first scenario, the first story, which you can just call the deep. So this is from Mark 4:35. So some of you may be familiar with this story, Jesus and his disciples. So his apprentices, if you like, his followers, but his close followers. They're in a fishing boat that would have been about roughly this size, would have looked remarkably like this, on the Sea of Galilee. So the Sea of Galilee, this actually big lake. And it's located well below sea level, but it's a big lake and it's still renowned to this very day for the sudden violent squalls that can appear on it. So again, it's probably a small boat. Again, if this is like a fairly accurate reconstruction, it could hold about 15 people, max 15 people. Now, Jesus' apprentices, his disciples, they're fishermen. So you think, surely they're going to be familiar with being out in the water. But they probably did most of their fishing close to shore. In this little passage, they're traversing from one side of this big lake to the other. So they're out in the middle, the deep. And the Jews at the time weren't known as being particularly strong swimmers. It wasn't really part of their culture. And it's evening, or it's night, so it's probably dark, and this big storm comes on. And everyone is terrified, the story tells us, apart from Jesus, who is asleep. So he's woken up by his disciples, his apprentices, with this really accusatory, do you not care that we are perishing, Jesus? Do you not care that we're perishing? That is, we're all going to die here, and all you can do is sleep through it. And Jesus, he then speaks to the elements, the wind. Hush, be still. Or, in other translations, quiet, with a big exclamation mark. Be still, with a big exclamation mark. And immediately, so no delay, straight away, it's dead calm, just like that. Now, I've heard this story so many times that I think I've got this risk of what you could call like the fairy tale effect kicking in. I've become so over familiar with it that some of its original meaning and impact can be lost on me. Jesus is certainly demonstrating his power, yes. Jesus is saving his friends, yes. But all the guys in the boat, devout Jews, would have been familiar with their scripture, with their Old Testament. Their minds, either during this event or after this event, would have remembered another famous Jewish prophet who was on a boat, had fallen asleep, and then was rudely woken up in the middle of a big storm. That prophet, Jonah, was then thrown overboard and the storm was stilled. In that account, all credit was given to God. And now, in our account, this person, a prophet, asleep on the boat, is woken up and calms a storm with a few words. So can we see the association? Further to that, Jesus' disciples would have been really familiar, chances are, with Psalm 107, which reads, "Those who go down to the sea in ships, who do business on great waters, they have seen the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. For he spoke and raised up a stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They rose up to the heavens, they went down to the depths. Their soul melted away in their misery. They reeled and staggered like a drunken man and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distresses. He caused the storm to be still, so that the waves of the sea were hushed." So both the Jonah story and this psalm make it clear that it's God who has power over the natural world. But now Jesus, in his person, is demonstrating that he too has power over creation, the elements. So Jesus isn't just showing that he's got power over creation, he's doing only what the Jews believed God could do. So he's demonstrating, not that he's just got this power, he's demonstrating, he's making the association explicitly that he is God. So you think, well, like you're about to die, and then you are miraculously saved, and you start to realise that the person who saved you may be somehow the God that you've long believed in, and your reaction is fear. So we read in the account that the poor disciples were afraid during the storm. They lacked trust in Jesus when they woke him up. So they're again effectively saying, "You don't care about us, you're sleeping through our imminent demise." And then after he saves them and he stills the storm, even after that, he asks them, "Why are you afraid? Have you no faith?" Which could be translated trust. And after this, they were still afraid, it says. In fact, they may have been even more afraid than during the storm. So back to our framework. Jesus is in the middle of this very scary situation, out in the depths, in the middle of a storm. His miracle, he ends that storm immediately. The response of the people around him, fear. Fear. Presumably, who he may be, the God-man, is too much for his followers in the moment. Maybe they're struggling to understand it. Maybe they're finding it understandably difficult to process what it means for them, both theologically and practically. But critically, and this is so important, Jesus doesn't chastise them for a lack of knowledge or understanding. He doesn't say, like, why don't you get it? Why don't you understand more? Why can't you comprehend this? Instead, he takes issue with their fear and lack of trust. So again, critically, it's not, don't you understand me? It's more, don't you trust me? Don't you trust me? So that's the first story. The second, if you're following along, this is the start of chapter 5, the demoniac. And this is going from one already dark place, out in the deep, to another, a very dark place. So it reads, they came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. So this was an area on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And although it's relatively close as the crow flies to the home of Jesus and his disciples, there's a good chance that none of them, or at least some of them, had never stepped on shore here before. And why? Because this area was largely settled and populated by Gentiles, non-Jews, with their pagan, Greco-Roman ways. So Jesus is deliberately heading to a ceremoniously unclean territory. And he is met by this poor guy, we read, this poor man who is possessed by unclean spirits. And this poor man has been living in unclean tombs and surrounded by pig farmers, a distinctly unclean occupation for Jews. So all this to say that this would be the last place that you'd expect Jesus and his disciples, being Jewish, to go. And on top of all the above, this poor guy was just an epicenter of pain and suffering. So just listen to this description. And no one was able to bind him, the demoniac, so again, this person who's possessed by demons, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains, and gashing himself with stones. That term, subdue, so subdue him, can apparently be translated tame, as in trying to tame or break a wild animal. This guy was so far beyond the pale, he was no longer being treated like a human, but as an animal that couldn't even be domesticated. He was completely other. The possession had turned him against himself, so he's hurting himself repeatedly, that's what the text says. And it had turned him against others as well. He lives amongst the dead. He literally lives amongst tombs, so just surrounded by dead people, and can't be contained by the living. That's his situation. But note, when Jesus arrives, we read, this guy approaches him and he bows down to Jesus. So no one else can bind this guy. He's completely out of control. But when confronted with the person of Christ, he runs to him and bows down. And he acknowledges Jesus as the Son of the Most High God. A really distinctive phrase. It means the top God amongst many gods. So the Son of the Most High God. So not just any God, not just the Son of any God, but the Most High God. This is a more pagan, non-Jewish title than Jewish. But the point here is that he's acknowledging Jesus as being with the highest God amongst many gods, the pagan world. So again, Mark is pointing out Jesus is no longer just being acknowledged as the God amongst the Jews, but now Jesus is God amongst the whole world, the pagan world as well. And Jesus casts out this demon, or these demons, effortlessly. So just like the storm, there is chaos, there is disorder, there is fear, there is suffering caused by these forces that are beyond human control. And Jesus effectively ends it with a sentence. So it's really important to see the supremacy here. There's no battle between almost equals. There's no classic 70s movie exorcism going on. It's all powerful monarch and a subject. That's all it is. It's no competition, no contest. And then have a look at the responses. The spirits say, when asked, that they are legion. A not so subtle reference to the Roman troops that had occupied the Jewish homeland. And so Jesus, on one level, is even showing the Romans who is in ultimate control. And then there's the loss of the pigs. If you're not familiar with the story, the demons beg Jesus to not cast them into the abyss, but for him to put them somewhere else. So the text reads that he casts them out, and they enter a bunch of pigs, a sizable bunch of pigs there. And I'm sorry for the pig lovers among you, bunch is not the technical term. What do we call that, a herd? What is that, a stable? I don't know, but more than one pig, there are a lot of pigs. And this is a big deal. The Jews wouldn't have been eating pork, obviously. Again, it would have been the Romans that were stationed there and the Gentiles. And the pigs' destruction would have been a sizable blow to the economy. The text reads they all run off the edge of a cliff and drown. This is important. Jesus appears to care more about the well-being of one human individual than the financial profit that presumably a few people were making at the time. Like, do we get that? Remarkable. He cares more about the well-being of one individual than, again, probably a few people that were making a lot of money off the swine. And then there's the response of the locals. They saw this guy who was presumably pretty kind of infamous. You know, he was big in his hometown, dressed, sitting down, healed. i.e. he's not running around screaming and cutting himself. He's in his right mind. He's whole. This is an indisputable miracle, and it's clearly for the better. You think, well, it's better for this guy. It's better for everyone. And of course, the locals say, well, this is great. Thanks, Jesus. Can you please stay with us a little bit longer so we can all learn more from you? But they don't. We read in the text, they implore Jesus to leave. Some commentators say that they effectively banished him. He was kicked out of this town. A bit like the disciples in the boat, this is all too much. It's almost as like if you were one of those locals, you could be thinking, look, Jesus, really, we had our social roles mapped out here. This guy, he was the crazy guy, right? Which means I could be the all-together, have it all together, kind of like stable guy. I mean, I had my issues, but at least I wasn't living in tombs cutting myself regularly. But now you've come along and done this. Where does that put me? Jesus messed with their economy. So look, I was doing pretty well with the pigs, Jesus. It was putting food on the table. I had money coming in. They were solid assets. The Romans weren't going anywhere. What do I do now? The olive market is already flooded. Like, where do I go? He messed both with their social structures and he messed with their economy as well. And so as a result, the people, they can't put him in a category. They want him gone. And this poor, now former demoniac, he's presumably feeling a bit guilty by association. Again, it was a lot of pigs. And he understandably probably doesn't want to start a new life in a place where everyone knew him as that demoniac guy who lived in the tomb. And he's probably also overwhelmed with gratitude for Jesus. So we read in that passage that, of course, he wants to jump in the boat with Jesus and follow him. He wants to go with him. He begs Jesus, "Can I come with you?" But Jesus, interestingly enough, insists that he stays. "Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on you." Now, as plenty of theologians and commentators have pointed out, this guy, no Bible college, no regular church attendance, no small group or Bible study, no company, he was solo, and maybe not even Jewish. But nevertheless, off you go, back home, go and basically, in Christianese, give your testimony. Report what great things the Lord has done for you. The Lord, a Jewish term for God, for the Jewish God. Again, Jesus is associating himself with God. Jesus has once again done what only God could do. And Jesus says, "Go back, tell people, just tell people what I've done for you." So the dark situation here that Jesus walks into, a demon-possessed man. The miracle, a complete and utter healing. The response, people kick him out. People want him out of town. And then we have the passage that we heard read before, death. This remarkable story. So Jesus enters into death. So we read about this desperate father, Jairus, a synagogue leader, so a respectable pillar of the community, with a 12-year-old daughter who's dying. And then this woman, this unnamed woman, enters the scene. She suffered also 12 years, so we've got the connection, 12-year-old daughter. This woman suffered 12 years with this hemorrhaging. And so all her money has been spent, we heard, on trying to find cures. None of it has been successful. She suffered in some ways at the hands of the ancient healers of the time. And again, because of this bleeding, she's been unable to be any part of the religious ceremonial life of her social circles for 12 years. She's been basically ostracized all this time because of her condition. And things, we read, are only getting worse for her. What does she do? She hears about Jesus. She comes to Jesus, she seeks him out, and she touches Jesus, his clothing. So she acts. So she hears, she comes, and she acts. And in that action, she violates both religious and cultural norms and standards of the day. She touches a man in public, and she's ceremonially unclean because of her bleeding. So she breaks a bunch of taboos there. But she believed. And maybe she believed because she'd tried everything else and nothing had worked, and she was desperate. Maybe that was the only cause of her belief. But she believed nevertheless, and she was healed immediately. But here's the kicker. Jesus, we read, knew that someone had been healed, had felt the power go out of him, and for almost 4 verses there, he's insistent on finding out who it was. The Greek translates not just he looked, but that he kept looking. He kept looking, even after his disciples tell him that it was futile. He wanted to find the someone, the individual. So maybe for her, it was just like initially enough to get healed. Maybe that's all she wanted. Even if it was just a fleeting and a personal touch. But Jesus wants to meet her. He wants to address her. And again, eventually, he wants to bless her. So we read, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." As Beck said before, Jesus wasn't just interested in people. He's interested in us personally, as persons, as individuals. And that's demonstrated right here. And you wonder, what does that say about God? Again, was it 8 billion, 8 billion people, but he still wants to address each of us individually and bless us. As you may remember, after her being healed, we read that Jairus' daughter has died. And so naturally, people tell him to leave Jesus alone. I mean, what's he going to do about it, Jairus? Is he going to bring him back to life? These people are reminding Jairus that it seems futile. What's the point? It's futile. But really interestingly, in verse 36, we read that Jesus overhears all these sensible but discouraging sentiments being said to Jairus. Jesus has picked that up. And he asks Jairus directly to do what I think he's going to ask all of us to do at one time or another in our lives. Don't be afraid. That is, don't despair. Only believe. Only believe. And in the Greek, interestingly enough, it's keep believing. So not just like a once and done, but keep believing. You thought, Jairus, that I was capable of healing her? Keep believing that. Don't get caught up in the circumstances, which you can't change. She's dead. You can't do anything about that. Keep believing in me, who is bigger than the circumstances. And that's just, wow, that's incredible. Just incredible. Because that's probably, in my mind at least, the hardest thing he could have asked Jairus to do there and then. But then when you think about it and step back, it's like, what else could Jairus do? He could despair, or he could believe. I don't know what the third way was. And he could believe like the unnamed woman only a few verses before him did. So this was like a big light bulb moment for me. Look what Mark has done here in terms of how he presents Jesus as reversing the social order of the day. Jairus has a name. The woman who we just read about doesn't. She's nameless. Jairus is an important man with a position, synagogue leader, and a house that he could invite Jesus to. The woman has been ostracized for 12 years, is broke, and has to approach Jesus in a crowd. But nevertheless, despite that kind of typical social hierarchy of the day, who in this story is the example of believing and not despairing? She is a primary example of that. She's the one who took the initiative, reached out to Jesus, and believed that she could be healed. Jairus, to some degree, is meant to follow her. So again, Jesus takes the expectation and tips it on its head. Now, in the wake of all this, the text says the crowds were astonished. Astonished. So that's the response there. They're astonished. And it's their astonishment which makes the last story in this little section the most poignant. So this is chapter 6, denial. So Jesus enters denial. After all this, Jesus and his disciples returned to his hometown of Nazareth. Nazareth was apparently a relative backwater. One commentator I read said it wasn't even mentioned. It's not even mentioned in the Old Testament. And at the time of Christ, it had maybe like 500 people living there. So after astonishing, amazing, and freaking people out in all these more cosmopolitan areas, Jesus returns home to be regarded with disdain and cynicism. So we read in chapter 6, verse 3, this verse really sums it up. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Jose and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? And they, again, his fellow hometowners, took offence at him. Just a note in this little verse, there's no reference of Joseph, his father. This could be an insinuation that he's illegitimate. They could be taking a shot at him in that regard. And more importantly, they take offence at him, which means in the context of Mark's gospel, that term offence means they don't believe and trust in him. They can't have faith in him. So after all these adventures, these three adventures, again, and everything that he's done, the last response that Jesus gets is effectively rejection from his own people. So, some quick ideas of what these four stories may mean for us here and now, just to wrap up. If you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, it's worth just giving pause as to the places that you'll likely end up having to follow him into. So these stories tell us that Jesus was willing to encounter vicarious pain, so other people's pain, which is just an absolutely horrid thing to be face to face with at times. He was willing to court controversy, ridicule, and not for their own sake, but for the sake of bringing other people healing and restoration. He said in other places, the servant is no greater than their master. Where he goes, we are supposed to follow. But see, at least in my very middle class, suburban, ultra comfortable world, this is disturbing. This call disturbs me. Because so much of my existence, and I don't think I'll be alone here, can be constructed around avoiding vicarious pain. I mean, I've got enough of my own pain. I don't really need yours on top of that, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to be greedy when it comes to pain. I'm trying to avoid controversy and ridicule. I'm too concerned, if you like, with my own pigs. I don't want to be thrown out of town. I mean, imagine what that would do to my social media platform. I don't want to get cancelled. But Jesus will do all this stuff, again, for the sake of restoring and bringing healing to other people. And usually the last, the lost, and the least. Not even like important people. Not even important people. So there's that. Also, again, just remember who this was originally written to. Chances are it was people who just weren't like dealing with the possibility of being cancelled socially, but literally being perhaps thrown to the lions or thrown into the Colosseum as well. And so Mark is saying, again, he's almost normalising the fact you follow Jesus, and the person you follow, again, was willing to enter into really tough, difficult spaces and contexts. At the very least, we can help anyone here. We can all help restore other people by following the lead of the former demoniac and simply letting other people that Jesus has surrounded us with know what the Lord has done for us. Right? That's within all our grasp. We can do that. If nothing else, just our testimony. And the amazing thing is that I think only relatively recently, the area where Jesus took care of that deliverance and delivered that poor man from his possession, again, the one that he returned to by himself and supposedly told his hometown about, they found a cathedral there hundreds of years later. So somehow along the line, probably, perhaps, this guy helped start something that resulted in a Christian community, a church, and not just any church, but a big church being planted in that very area. So God, again, could have used that guy and his testimony, again, no training, no background, no professionalism, just his testimony remarkably. That's all within our grasp. Go and tell the people in your life the good things that God has done for you. So there's that. Again, if you're a Christian, how are you going with not being afraid and only believing? I almost feel like I'm raining on a parade here, but I at least find it useful to be reminded that what we read here in Mark wasn't the end of the story when it comes to hope for Jesus' disciples, the former demoniac, Jairus' daughter, and the woman with no name. It wasn't the end of all their stories when it came to hope. Jairus' daughter was raised from the dead, we read, only to have to eventually die again. Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples who was in that boat with him, was saved from the storm, only to eventually die a martyr, supposedly crucified upside down. Do you see? Hope, trust, is not a one and done. It's likely going to be a weekly, if not daily, recommitment in the face of everyday, regular life challenges to believe in Jesus and not despair. And it's likely going to culminate in facing our own mortality and having a choice of focusing on the very real circumstances that are in front of us. I'm getting older. I'm going to lose my current capacities. I'm going to eventually die. Or focus on Jesus. Jesus is God and King. Jesus has the power over death and decay. He can, he has, and he will bring life after death. And in this, I'm secure. And if you're not a Christian or you're on the fence today, can I ask, what will you do when just inevitably faced with some version of the deep, the death, and the demonic? How will you handle those big Ds without Jesus? How will you not despair or give in to fear? There seems to be this moment of choice that all of us face at least once. And it's either trusting in Jesus, despite us finding him disturbing and breaking our preconceived categories of God, humanity in the world, that's one choice, or we deny him, like those in his hometown. And look, I'm not pretending that either choice is easy. I'd argue either way, either choice requires some faith, as Mike talked about last week. It takes a lot of faith, it takes a lot of active trust to believe that Jesus is God after your 12-year-old daughter has just died. I'd say it also takes a lot of faith to dismiss Jesus and ask him to leave your town just after you've seen him miraculously and undeniably change someone else's entire life. So to believe or not to believe in God, they're both acts of faith. And lastly, whatever you do, please just don't dismiss these stories and see Jesus as a helpful myth or some kind of encouraging morality tale. I came across this podcast recently where a guy called Dr. Martin Shaw, he's a recent convert to Christianity over the last couple of years and a scholar of myths. So he studies myths, and that's what he's got his PhD in, and now he's like a kind of professional storyteller. He said on this podcast that that the most disturbing thing for him about the Gospels, the thing that kind of got into his head and irked him when he was on the fence about Christianity, was that the Gospels came with a postcode. They came with a postcode. And by that, he meant you can still sail a boat on the Sea of Galilee. You can literally walk around the ruins of that cathedral of Hippos that I was talking about before, the district where that former demoniac lived. These gospel accounts, like Mark's, were never intended to be considered as just inspiring stories. They are records of historical events. And this is a good thing, right? Because it gives more reason to believe and trust in Jesus. It's also a scary thing, on the other hand, because we can't just have Jesus as a wise teacher and moral example, because he historically claimed to be so much more than that. So I hope that's been encouraging. And I'd just like to leave you to ponder. We've heard about different people's responses to Jesus. So now's a natural time just to ask, what's our response going to be? Again, we've heard, and as Beck pointed out before, he's interested in you as an individual. He's interested, believe it or not, in what your response to him is going to be as a person. Okay, let me pray. Father, once again, I thank you for these records about your son. I thank you that he is just so big and so vast that he does just defy and blow up our preconceived categories and ideas about you and about humanity and about life. And I pray that if we need to be, that you'll just like knock us around a little bit, help us be, again, if needed, a little bit disturbed. Help us not get too, I suppose, complacent with you, but help us always view you with fresh eyes. And again, if we need a reminding, help remind us about the fact that you are God and you are our King. And I thank you again that despite that and all the power that goes along with that, you are still interested in us on the level of individuals, of persons, Father. I thank you for the great comfort that can be. Amen.